Up until about 6 hours ago, I had one set of prepared remarks. I'm throwing them out. Uh, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time. My speech is America in the World, the next 20 years. And I'm going to get to that subject, but I wanted to talk about something that is a little more pressing, and I think at least on my mind, and I think perhaps on the mind of many of you here. And in order to talk about this subject, I want to talk about what it's like to win a Pulitzer Prize, since this is a writers' festival. And a particular experience I had winning the prize that I think is appropriate to what's happening around American airports today. So when I won the prize, the first thing that a colleague of mine who'd won it before, Dorothy Rabinowitz, said, "Congratulations, you now know how your obituary is going to begin." Oh, great. Called up my mother. I said, "Mom, I won the Pulitzer Prize." She said, "Oh, sweetie, that's wonderful. Now the stupid people will know you're smart." I have a very Jewish mother who thinks that I'm a disgrace for not being a doctor. But I want to tell you a little bit about the prize ceremony itself. The prizes are typically announced in April, and then there's this luncheon at Low Library at Columbia that typically takes place at the end of May, beginning of June. And so naturally, for the luncheon, I had two guests I could bring. I had my wife there, and I brought my mother. So we're sitting in this cavernous main area in Low Library waiting for the prizes to be announced, being served a rubber chicken luncheon. And my mother turns to me and she says, "You know, I've been in this building before." I said, "What brought you to this building?" She said, "Well, when I was 18, right out of high school, I wanted to enroll in a few courses at the Columbia School of General Studies. And it turned out that the office where she would need to enroll and pay $150 or whatever the price was to enroll in this course, it was at the basement of Low Library. So she went down to the basement and wanted to pay for this particular class, and the woman behind, or the person behind the window, who was supposed to take her check, said, "Oh, no, you can't enroll in this course. You need to take English as a second language." Now, my mother, just a little bit of background, was the daughter of a family that had first had to flee Russia after 1917, after the Bolsheviks took over, and then had moved to Germany. And then in 1933, when Hitler came to power, they had to flee Germany. They went to Italy, which before the race laws was comparatively a better place for the Jews. My mother was born in Italy, in Milano, in 1940, just a few months after the beginning of the war. And her mother had managed to get an assumed name. Our family name was Grodzinski. It somehow miraculously became Ksevani. And my mother spent the first 5 years of her life in a garret apartment protected by friends. And after the war, she lived in Italy. She was a displaced person of no fixed nationality. And eventually, she and her mother, there was no father to speak of, were able to get papers to come to the United States. She arrived in this country as a 10-year-old girl in November of 1940, displaced person, refugee. She enrolled in public schools. Her mother was desperately poor. They came to this country with $7. And eventually, bizarrely, her mother then moved to California with my mother, with my grandmother. My grandmother was a fitter and worked at a place called Amelia Gray on Wilshire Boulevard, but in not a very exalted position. My mother went to high school in LA, spoke fluent English, but to this day my mother speaks with a very pronounced European accent. So after high school, she went to that window at Columbia University only to be told by some factotum at Columbia that she would not ever be able to get a college education of any kind because she spoke with a thick accent. I only learned this story 54 years later when I was sitting in Low Library with my mother waiting to receive the Pulitzer Prize. So I'm emotional today because we have another instance in which the subject of refugees is at the forefront of our political consciousness. And I think that as an entry point into this subject of America and the world for the next 20 years, it behooves us to think about who those refugees were and what their sons and daughters would eventually become. So right now, there are people waiting in airports, waiting to get into this country, who are being treated with the utmost suspicion, that they come from the wrong countries, that perhaps they belong to the wrong religion, and harbor the wrong politics. We should begin any discussion about America and the world by thinking about just who those refugees are and where their kids might end up. Now, there are two ways of approaching the subject of what happens for the next 20 years. I was tempted, and this was the speech I had in mind before today, I was tempted to offer you a series of predictions. Predictions are wonderful, and the more distant the prediction, the safer it is to make. The panel that is going to come up on stage after me, a very distinguished panel, is in a bit of a pickle. They don't know it, but I'm going to explain it to them. They are supposed to tell you what's going to happen in the next 4 years. That is to say, you might remember 4 years from now what it is that they had to say. Whereas if I were to offer you predictions for the year 2037, I assure you that none of you would have the faintest memory of what I said tonight. And this is actually a bit of a racket, predictions. George Friedman of Stratfor makes a wonderful living saying things like, in the future, Peru is going to corner the market on guano and lithium and become the most important country in the world. People pay a lot of money to hear insights like that. And I'm tempted to make some of my own. One of the things that I did as an intellectual curiosity is I went back to the January 1997 issue of Foreign Affairs magazine. Foreign Affairs, one of the most distinguished, if not the most distinguished foreign policy journal of our time. And I just opened the pages at random to see what was being said 20 years ago about the future, about what the future would hold. And I just wanted to read you a few excerpts as to what they had to say. Here's an article by David Remnick, who's of course now the editor of The New Yorker, and a very fine journalist, expert on Russia. He was writing a piece on the prospects for Russian democracy. This is a quote. "There seems to be no reason why Russia cannot break free with its absolutist past in much the way that Germany and Japan did after World War II." End of quote. Next article was by an economist named Peter Sutherland talking about the prospects for European monetary union. He said, "The critics maintain that European monetary union will not work because the member states will fail to reform their rigid labor markets and burdensome welfare systems. Predicting that those efforts will not succeed seems unnecessarily pessimistic. Here's a third article, same issue. This is by Nick Eberstadt, a demographer at the American Enterprise Institute. This one's about Korean unification. He writes, quote, "It is time for statesmen in the Pacific and beyond to think about how to make Korean reunification a success, because success or no, reunification is coming." So in other words, whoops, whoops, and more whoops. So what I am going to try to do is approach this subject from a slightly different vantage point, which is to say that prediction really is a business of divination, and it's somewhat useless to indulge in that. What I think is a much more interesting approach to how to think about America and the world for the next 20 years isn't by making predictions which may be far-fetched or realistic or not, but it's by asking a series of questions which I think will determine the nature of our relationship and place in the world over the next 2 decades. And I wanted to offer you 6 questions which I thought would be worth examining. The first question is, and this goes to what I was saying at the very beginning with respect to the refugee issue now taking place. Are we a country that seeks and attracts human capital and believes in being fundamentally open to the world? Or are we not such a country? Second question, are we a self-critical country, or are we a country of blamers, blaming one group or another for our problems? Third question, do we define our interests according to our values, or our values according to our interests? Let me repeat that. Do we decide what our values are because we have X, Y, and Z interests around the world, or do we ask ourselves, what are our values, and then say, well, what interests would follow from those values? I think that's a fundamental question too. Fourth question, do we have a healthy innovation culture in this country? I think that is fundamental to the next 20 years. Fifth, do we have a healthy civic culture in this country? And final question, and perhaps the most important question, are we still a nation of optimists? So another way of putting those 6 questions. Number 1, what is our attitude towards foreigners? Number 2, what is our attitude toward failure? Number 3, what is our attitude toward global leadership? Number 4, what is our attitude towards change? 5, what is our attitude toward each other? And finally, what is our attitude toward the future? And I think those 6 questions are the questions that we need to answer in some way and think about in some deep way if we're going to have a sense of how it will play out for the United States in the coming years. Let me take the first question, which is the question about our attitude toward human capital, because it's easy to think of human capital in one of 2 ways. One of them is immigrants. They steal our jobs. Immigrants, they overwhelm our welfare system. Immigrants, they bring cultures and values which we have yet to assimilate and which may not be entirely in tune with our own. Another way of thinking about immigrants is immense human potential. Let me put a few data points in your head. Did you know that the United States has won 42% of all Nobel Prizes awarded between 1901 and last year? 42%. Did you also know that more than 30% of those Nobel Prizes were won by Americans who were not born in the United States? That's an interesting little detail. Second data point. Did you know that 90 of the Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants? And another 114 of those companies were founded by the children of immigrants. These founders include founder of Google, co-founder of Google, Sergey Brin, born in Russia; Pierre Omidyar, founder of eBay, born in France; Andy Grove, co-founder of Intel, born in Hungary; founder of Comcast, Daniel Aron, co-founder of Comcast, was a refugee from Nazi Germany in the 1930s. In other words, 40% of Fortune 500 companies were either founded by immigrants or the children of immigrants. Interesting little data point. Here's another question. Here I'm quoting from a report. Did you know that revenue generated by Fortune 500 companies founded by those immigrants or children of immigrants in 2010 was greater than the gross domestic product of every country in the world outside the United States except for China and Japan? These Fortune 500 companies had combined revenues of $4.2 trillion, 1.7 trillion of which were from immigrant-founded countries. Did you know that if we make good on the threat or the promise to remove all undocumented workers, it would mean an estimated loss of private sector output of somewhere between $382 billion and $623 billion a year? Did you also know that if we're going to attempt to remove the estimated 11 million undocumented workers from the United States, it would cost the government an estimated $600 billion, which is more than the budget for the Defense Department. Finally, did you know that if it weren't for the fact that we have an immigration culture, we would have negative population growth? Now that's very significant because when economists tell you what makes for economic growth, there are two fundamental inputs. One is productivity growth, the other is population growth. Why is Japan stagnant? Why is Europe stagnant? Not enough people. If it weren't for immigrants, we would have population decline at this moment. So people who think about the nexus of immigration and economic growth understand that the latter depends on the former. So when we think about America's relationship with the world, it will be determined in large part by our attitude toward strangers, our attitude toward foreigners. Because the moral issues aside, immigrants are essential to maintaining our economic and scientific leadership in the world. Second point that I want to talk about is the attitude toward failure. It was funny, as I was leafing through that 1997 Foreign Affairs magazine, I came across a genuinely prophetic and interesting article from Bernard Lewis, who's now 101 years old, greatest historian of the Middle East. And he writes in this article, which is an article about the Middle East and its relationship with the West, says something that I think is worth sharing. He writes, "When people realize things are going wrong, there are two questions they can ask. One is, what did we do wrong? And the other is, who did this to us?" The latter question, he says, leads to conspiracy theories and paranoia. The first question leads to another line of thinking. How do we put it right? Now this, when anyone who spent a significant amount of time in the Middle East, anyone who spent a lot of time, especially in the Arab world, knows how powerful conspiracy theories are in those countries. One of the features about anti-Semitism, for instance, is that anti-Semitism is not just a prejudice against Jews. Anti-Semitism is itself a conspiracy theory. Someone is pulling the strings towards nefarious ends in this world, and it happens to be the Jews. Anti-Semitism is hatred of Jews turned into a conspiracy theory. And the result has been that kind of thinking, the who did this to us kind of thinking, has done a lot to impoverish sociologically, economically, politically, the life of Middle Eastern countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, you name it. Now the question, though, is, and I think we ought to be asking ourselves, is whether we here in the United States aren't also at risk of adopting a who did this to us frame of mind. And I think this is happening on a bipartisan basis. This is happening both on the left and on the right. Right now there is a terrible murder rate in Chicago. Most of this is gang-related violence. Most of this, tragically, is violence by African Americans against African Americans. Now, it doesn't help if there is a conspiracy theory, a who did this to us mentality that says none of this is about what's happening inside a community, it's about what the cops are doing to us. That does not help those communities. But it's also happening on the right of this country. Why are we in economic trouble? According to a certain theory, we are because we've had horrible trade deals in which geniuses in Mexico City and Beijing have managed to pull the economic strings against our own interests. That's who did this to us. Why do we have unemployment issues? It's because immigrants are pouring across this country and stealing our jobs. That is also who did this to us. And if we're going to be a successful country over the next 20 years, we have to think carefully about that distinction and about understanding that countries that prosper and countries that lead aren't blame countries. They're self-critical countries. They're countries that are able to look at their problems and say, this is about what we can change, not about what someone else is busy doing. Third point that I want to make is about leadership. It's the point about values and interests. We now have, thanks to our inaugural address, we now learn that we're living in an America First kind of world. Of course, this phrase, for those of you who are of a certain age, has a historical resonance going back to 1940, 1941. Now, there's an alternative tradition in American foreign policy to America First, and that was the tradition articulated after World War II by people like Dean Acheson and Harry Truman, two Democrats, but also by people like Arthur Vandenberg, Republican, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. These are the people who gave us the Truman Doctrine, not just containment, Pax Americana, if you will, but believed in the importance of American engagement with the rest of the world and American leadership with the rest of the world. And not just leadership by the fact that we had the largest economy or we had sole possession of atomic weapons at the time, but moral leadership. Let me give you an example, and this ought to stay in your minds. In 1947, 1948, really, Joseph Stalin blockaded the enclave of West Berlin. And he did this was in violation of the post-war Potsdam agreements. And he thought that because he had masses of Soviet troops encircling this tiny little enclave of freedom, that he could bully the West into abandoning its position in West Berlin. When this happened, there were generals advising President Truman who said to him, why should we be defending West Berlin? We've got several thousand troops there. It's an indefensible, at least a militarily indefensible position. We are putting them at risk for the sake of pure symbolism, which is the city of Berlin. We don't particularly like the Germans anyway. We just defeated them in World War II and they just conducted the Holocaust. Why should we risk so much simply for the sake of West Berlin? Truman insisted, almost unthinkingly, but insisted that we would resupply West Berlin. We would do so through the airlift, which at first was, the story is often told as this kind of amazing technological challenge of using small DC-3s or smaller planes to send them to Temple Hof Airport and feed a starving city of 2 million people. Objectively speaking, the defense of West Berlin made no sense whatsoever. It only made sense from a moral point of view. And yet Truman did it, and the siege ended after several months, and a number of things happened. Number one, the Germans understood that there's no greater country in the world than the United States, and a generation of Germans grew up remembering the candies that were thrown out from the window as the planes were approaching Tempelhof Airport. And we created out of an enemy one of our greatest allies in the world today. Number two, countries like France and Italy saw that if the United States was prepared to come to the defense of a tiny little ridiculous embattled enclave like West Berlin, we would also be committed to the wider defense of all of Western Europe, that our guarantees through NATO were going to be good. Number three, West Berlin then flourished and became this extraordinary enclave of what a free society can be: prosperous, capitalistic, democratic. So no accident, comrades, that 41 years after the Berlin airlift in 1989, when the Cold War ended and the United States won perhaps the biggest or the second biggest geopolitical struggle of the 20th century, it did so not in Moscow or somewhere else in the world or in Vietnam. It did so in Berlin, because those people in East Berlin could see with their own eyes what the West was like and what a lie their own regime was. So by maintaining that moral commitment to a foreign policy in which values defined our interests and not the other way around, we actually won this extraordinary fight against the evil empire without ever having to fire a shot. Are we going to be a country over the next 20 years that understands that those moral commitments that we now make to an Estonia, to a Taiwan, to an Israel, to the little embattled outposts of freedom, that that kind of moral leadership is the sort of investment that over time pays the biggest geopolitical dividends? Now, the fourth point, attitudes towards change. Countries that thrive are adaptable countries. Countries that succeed understand that nothing in culture, nothing in economics, nothing in society is ever static, that innovation and change is inevitable, and the societies that do best are the ones that embrace it. Now, some of you in this room are foolish enough to be regular readers of my column, and so you know that I have not been hugely sympathetic to the incoming administration. But I do want to stop here and give the Trump vote and the Trump voter his due. If you are involved in innovation, if your life is not part of the word-making economy like mine is, or lawyers are, bureaucrats are, academics are, but if your life is part of the things-making economy, then you have probably suffered over the past 8 years. There's an incredible statistic I came across a few days ago. In 2006, there were 614,000 startup businesses in the United States, not just technology, but startups of any kind, people starting businesses. In 2014, which is the last year for which we have data, those 614,000 had dropped to 452,000. That is, I think off the top of my head, a 26% drop in the amount of economic activity, new economic activity in the United States. Now, this also coincides with other drops. The World Bank keeps a survey called Ease of Doing Business, which it ranks countries according to how easy it is to start a business. 2009, when President Obama took office, the United States ranked number 3 in the world, just behind Singapore and New Zealand. 2016, as he left office, the United States had dropped to 8th place. It used to take 300 days to enforce a contract in the United States. Today, it takes 420 days. It used to take 40 days to get a building permit in the United States. It now takes an average of 81 days. The cost of registering property in the United States in the last 8 years has risen more than five-fold, up to 2.5% of the purchasing price. And all of this has accreted slowly, in large part thanks to regulations which are always well-intentioned and almost invariably have toxic side effects or difficult side effects on business creators. And some of you in this room, I suspect, can testify to that reality. So the question then confronts us, which is that a country that wants to lead the world, wants to have a claim to leadership of the world, is going to have to be the most innovative country in the world. And if there's one, for me, light for this administration, and as I said, I've been a terrific critic of the administration, it is the possibility that we may be able to once again be the innovative society that we had been before and where we're slowly losing that edge. Two more things I want to mention. Attitudes towards each other. Something bad happened in this country over the last few years, and perhaps I didn't notice it as much as I ought to have, because until recently I wasn't on the receiving end of the badness. It's a Trumpian word. Badness. I can't believe at a writers' conference I have a Pulitzer Prize and all I can do is think of badness. We have begun to demonize whole classes of people in this country. Now, part of this, and this is again a bipartisan phenomenon, we had 60 million voters described as members of a basket of deplorables earlier this year. That turned out to be not only untrue, but not particularly good politics. But we also now have a new form of demonization. That is the demonization of the Washington establishment. Who's the Washington establishment? The people you guys elect. That's the Washington establishment. And yet we are constantly told that this is a particularly nefarious and self-dealing people. The lobbyists on K Street, another group of evil people, they're evil until they happen to represent your interests, whether it's the Sierra Club or the NRA or AIPAC or whatever particular part of K Street you agree with, but the rest of it is just a bunch of malefactors. Then we have, of course, the mainstream media. That would be me. There is something frightening about this persistent assault on the legitimacy and the fundamental decency and the honor of those members of my profession who are often risking everything, including their own lives, to give you a bit of news that's somewhat harder and truer than what you might be reading at Breitbart.com. So if we're going to have a successful next 20 years, we have to start doing something to restore our civic culture. Everyone here is to blame. The left is to blame for the nonstop demonization in academic circles about American foundational institutions, about the basic decency of our form of government, about our efforts to perfect past injustices. But the right also has to be careful, especially now that it wields executive authority, about spending too much time complaining about those evil coastal elites, or just people paying higher taxes than the rest of you lucky guys in flyover country. Final point. Point is about attitudes towards the future and optimism. You know, after watching President Trump's magnificent inaugural address, I went back and I was reading pieces of Reagan's inaugural address. You should go and read what he had to say about his confidence about the future, and about the realization that it's always in our hands to make a better future for ourselves, that we're masters of our own destiny. 50 years from now, the year, never mind 2037, 2077, there's going to be a young woman who's going to be one of your unborn great-grandchildren. She's going to be a professor of economic history at a truly great university, which would be the University of Chicago. And she's going to be talking to her students, and she's going to be asking them, what do you think the great inventions of the early 20th century were, the ones that really set the tone for the economy of this century in the way that the Model T or the Wright Flyer set the tone for the economy of the 20th century? And one student is going to raise her hand and say, well, probably social media, right? And the apps revolution. That may have had something to do with the economies of the 21st century, this radical new way of connecting different people in this incredibly horizontal way and opening all these platforms and venues for new forms of expression and communication, and also all those apps where you can touch something on a screen and suddenly Bret Stephens, who's incapable of assembling IKEA furniture, can get someone from TaskRabbit to do it for him for $30 and make his life a lot easier and not unman him before his wife. And the teacher will say, yes, the apps revolution, social media, definitely big ones. What's another thing? Well, another student will say, probably fracking. In 2010, Paul Krugman wrote the greatest column of all time. He said, we've reached peak oil, and America will never be a part of the energy story again. I actually keep that column in my desk drawer because when I feel like I'm writing a cruddy column, I open, I think, it can't be worse than that one. Of course, 5 years later, we're the world's largest energy producer, and we live in an era of energy superabundance, and we have to think about how we're responsible stewards of that, but that's, of course, changing the economy of the 21st century. And the final thing I would say is one of those students will say, probably cancer immunotherapy, because in the mid-20th century, most people died sometime in their 60s of heart attacks. And then in the early 21st century, people were dying in their 70s and 80s of cancer. But once cancer immunotherapy managed to conquer cancer, we were able to move to a new generation in which the real challenges were Alzheimer's, dementia, the diseases of your late 80s and 90s, and we were able to radically extend the lifespan and the working life of millions of Americans and transform economics. After these students make these observations, the teacher will say, this is interesting. Every single one of those inventions was made in the United States. All of them have their origins in the innovation culture, the immigration culture, the experimentation culture that is so unique to this country. And to have optimism that we are capable of having that future will determine where we are in 2037. I want to make one tiny final point. After everyone in this room is gone, and this is a prediction for 2037, after everyone in this room is gone, you're having dinner, the cleaning crew is going to come in here, and they're going to consist overwhelmingly probably of Hispanic Americans. We're going to be cleaning up this area. Here's my prediction for 2037. The child of one of those people cleaning up in 2037 is going to be speaking from this podium. That's my prediction. So I just want to close by saying thank you, Jamie. Please have faith in the United States, and please have faith in those who right now are the least among us, but will someday be the Nobel laureates, the Pulitzer Prize winners, the entrepreneurs, the inventors, the discoveries for the rest of our century. Thank you very much.